Coming up on New Day at Arirang, Russia intensifies its attacks on key Ukrainian cities with fighting raging for a seventh day in the north, east and southern areas. Meanwhile, members of the UN General Assembly voted to condemn Russia's invasion by a massive margin of 141 votes to 5. South Korea is set to report around 200,000 new COVID-19 infections again on Thursday. Despite the high figures, authorities are considering options to ease social distancing measures, allowing gatherings of up to 8 until 11 p.m. And the four main presidential candidates in Korea faced off in their final TV debate Wednesday evening. There, they clashed on various issues from welfare, taxation, and the country's chronic birth rate problem.
Hello and welcome to this Thursday edition of New Day at Arirang. I'm Mark Broom. Thank you ever so much for joining us.
And I'm Kim Mo-Gan. It's 8 a.m. in Seoul, Korea on March 3rd. And over the next hour, we'll take a look at the big news stories of the day and get expert insights on the issues facing Korea and the world.
Yes, we will. And we begin with the COVID-19 situation in South Korea. The country saw the new daily tally top 200,000 for the very first time on Wednesday. And although it's not expected to go that high today, it will come close.
Yes, for more on this, we have our reporter Kim Bo-kyung here in the studio with us. Good morning, Bo-kyung.
Good morning.
Let's start with the local infections.
Well, we're expecting to see a daily tally near 200,000 mark because as of 9 p.m. Wednesday, South Korea reported 186,169 new infections. That is 18,791 fewer than from the same period the previous day. Though we are seeing a drop, it is still 24,787 more than a week ago and twice as many as was reported 2 weeks ago on February 16th. Though the number itself seems shocking, according to health authorities, the pace of new cases is slowing down somewhat, though further observation is needed to see if this is a part of a clear trend.
And we're also hearing cases of what is being labeled stealth Omicron. These infections are on the rise in Korea as well.
That is right. That is what was said by a spokesperson from a Korea Disease Control and Prevention Agency during a briefing on Wednesday. Health authorities say they are keeping a close eye on the BA.2 version of Omicron, nicknamed stealth Omicron. Researchers say this variant is much more contagious than the original. The number of cases of stealth Omicron is increasing, both domestically and abroad. In South Korea, among the number of locally transmitted cases, the detection rate for the BA.2 version Omicron rose to more than 10% in the fourth week of February. It was just 1% in the first week of that month. When it comes to imported cases, it has risen to more than 18% from 10%. The official said that as the number of stealth Omicron cases increase, it will be carefully monitored to determine any impact on the number of confirmed cases or the peak of the pandemic.
Now, Bo-kyung, what about the government's preventative measures for children and pregnant women? What are they?
Well, as the number of young children testing positive goes up, the health authority has designated specialist clinics to treat kids with COVID-19. The health authority is working with the Korea Children's Hospital Association to designate 26 children's hospitals that run respiratory clinics, and it will offer 1,442 sickbeds for those who need them. Children under the age 11 will be given priority to see a doctor or be hospitalized if required. The list of these specialist clinics will not be open to the public in order to avoid any confusion. Rather, those in need will be guided to visit the hospitals. The number of children with COVID-19 between the ages of 5 and 11 made up more than 12% of cases in the fourth week of last month. And meanwhile, the government has asked hospitals to let expectant mothers give birth even if the hospital does not have negative pressure delivery beds, as there is a shortage of those beds due to the surge in the number of cases. Instead, the government is to cover any associated prevention costs for those hospitals.
Now, the policy in Korea is that people who have symptoms of Omicron are to test themselves at home using these self-testing kits that you can purchase from pharmacies, and then possibly then going to some kind of screening centre after that. However, there are some concerns being raised over the accuracy of these at-home testing kits. Why exactly is that, and is there anything that can be done in this situation?
Well, there are lots of people, like you said, who have tested negative through self-testing kits, but tested positive when having rapid antigen tests done at clinics. The Korean Society for Laboratory Medicine says the results are not that precise, with a detection rate of only 20% if people do it themselves, and 50% if done by medical staff. That is because at the early stage of the infection, one needs to get the sample from the deep inside the nose, that is more than 10 centimeters in, but self-testing kits can only get the sample from near the nostril. Besides, it is difficult for people who have no anatomical knowledge of the nose to do it properly. Therefore, medical experts recommend those with symptoms to get rapid antigen tests from doctors' clinics.
But despite this current situation, we hear that authorities are planning to ease some social distancing restrictions.
That's right. As you said, the government is considering easing social distancing measures as it sees any strengthening of measures to be ineffective. Originally, social gathering caps of a maximum 6 people and 10 p.m. shutdown orders were to remain until March 13th. However, health authorities said that as the government is to put all efforts into minimizing the number of critically ill patients and deaths, rather than the number of the cases, the country is mulling over easing distancing measures. The consideration also takes into account the low fatality rate and the damage small business owners are dealing with. The government might change the rules as early as this Friday after consulting with medical experts, business owners, and local governments.
Right, so it seems like we will have to wait and see. Thank you so much for your efforts, Pokyeong.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, as always. Moving on to the other big news of the day. It's the 7th day of the invasion, and Russia is pushing on with its military offensive on Ukraine, killing hundreds of civilians in the process of bombing and street-to-street fighting.
The number of Ukrainian troops killed estimated to total almost 2,900. And Russia has also been suffering losses, with Moscow's defense ministry admitting Wednesday that nearly 500 Russian troops have been killed. Ji-young has more.
For 7 days and marching into the country from multiple directions, Russian troops continuing their attack on Ukraine. Ukrainian counterattacks and logistic mishaps have hampered Russia's attack on Kyiv, but Russian forces have pushed through Ukraine's second-largest city of Kharkiv in a bid to demoralize the country's resistance. Ukrainian officials say the civilian death toll is already around 2,000.
I want to tell those who are shooting here, the Russian soldiers, I want them to understand that civilians and children are dying here. You should understand that the orders given to you by your commanders should not be obeyed. It's your choice.
The suffering of Moscow's military has also been brought to light for the first time, with Russia's defense ministry admitting Wednesday the extent of casualties it has suffered in the 7 days since the invasion. It said 498 Russian servicemen have been killed and almost 1,600 injured. Ukraine has not announced its military casualties, but claims its military has killed around 5,800 Russian troops. Meanwhile, the UN's nuclear watchdog says Russia has seized control of Ukraine's largest nuclear power plant. The International Atomic Energy Agency revealing the Russian military has gained control of territory around the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, adding the IAEA is talking to all sides in regards to nuclear safety assistance to Ukraine.
The important matter here is that when there is a conflict ongoing, there is, of course, a risk of attack or the possibility of an accidental hit. In terms of attack, we do not expect this to happen. I believe that all countries, without exception, are going to be respecting the decisions of the IAEA and the General Conference.
Despite the dwindling hope of a diplomatic breakthrough, a second round of Russia-Ukraine talks is set for Thursday. Russian state news agency RIA reports the meeting will be held in Belarus near the country's border with Poland. The first round of talks on Monday lasted about 5 hours but did not produce any tangible results. Ji-young, Arirang News.
141 members of the UN General Assembly have voted in favor of a resolution denouncing Russia's aggression against Ukraine and demanding an immediate withdrawal of its troops. This comes as the U.S. announced new sweeping sanctions against Moscow. Kim Hyo-san reports.
The UN General Assembly has voted overwhelmingly for a resolution denouncing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The resolution, backed by 141 of the Assembly's 193 members, was passed Wednesday in a rare emergency session called by the UN Security Council to discuss the Ukraine crisis. It calls for Russia to stop fighting and withdraw its forces immediately, completely, and unconditionally. South Korea also supported the resolution, while 5 countries, including North Korea, Belarus, and Syria, voted against. Speaking before the vote, the U.S. ambassador to the UN stressed that the war must stop.
And today, we stand together in holding Russia accountable for its violations of international law and to address the horrific human rights and humanitarian crisis unfolding before our eyes.
Meanwhile, the Biden administration detailed a new set of economic sanctions against Russia and its ally Belarus. They include restrictions on Moscow's oil exports as well as sweeping sanctions targeting Russia's defense-related entities. Washington also explained its extension of export control policies to Belarus and preventing the diversion of technology and software to Russia through the country. This, the Biden administration says, will severely limit their ability to obtain the materials needed to support their military aggression against Ukraine. These measures come on the heels of Washington's banning of Russian aircraft from U.S. airspace. Over in Europe, the EU decided to cut Russian banks from the SWIFT payment system on Wednesday. Accordingly, SWIFT said in a statement that it would cut off 7 Russian banks from the network from March 12th. The 27-member bloc also banned Kremlin-controlled media outlets from broadcasting into the bloc. Kim Hyo-san, Arirang News.
Now, it was widely expected, but US President Joe Biden's first State of the Union address to Congress on Tuesday night was heavily focused on the conflict in Ukraine, especially the first portion of it. He called on Russian leader Vladimir Putin to stop the invasion, saying Putin has miscalculated. He also announced more sanctions on Moscow. Kim Da-mi with this report.
President Biden said Tuesday in his first State of the Union address that the free world has banded together in response to the crisis in Ukraine, with EU members and other allies, including South Korea, holding Russian President Vladimir Putin accountable.
Throughout our history, we've learned this lesson. When dictators do not pay a price for their aggression, they cause more chaos. They keep moving.
Biden warned that Putin, in attempting to shake the foundations of the free world, has badly miscalculated and now faces a wall of strength he never imagined. He said Putin is more ostracized from the world than ever and announced more sanctions on Moscow, effective immediately as of the next day.
And tonight, I'm announcing that we will join our allies in closing off American airspace to all Russian flights, further isolating Russia and adding additional squeeze on their economy. He has no idea what's coming.
Biden then pledged to provide military, economic, and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, including more than $1 billion in direct aid. But he also made it clear that U.S. forces are not going to engage in conflict with the Russian forces in Ukraine. China was also near the top of Biden's traditional address to Congress, where he pledged to win what he called the economic competition of the 21st century, saying it's, quote, never been a good bet to bet against the American people. Biden also laid out plans to tame the worst inflation in nearly 40 years, such as manufacturing cars and semiconductors locally instead of relying on foreign supply chains. Praising the country's fight against the pandemic, Biden said that COVID-19 need no longer control Americans' lives and pledged that his administration will continue to respond to new variants and secure treatment. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. As we just heard there, US President Joe Biden delivered on Tuesday his first State of the Union address before a joint session of Congress. As was widely expected, he spent the vast majority of the first portion of the speech largely addressing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He also revealed the US is closing its airspace to Russian planes.
President Biden also spoke about his ongoing concerns over COVID-19, soaring inflation in the U.S., the tax system, and police reform. For more on this, we're joined by Ramon Pacheco-Pardo, Professor of International Relations at King's College London. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So what did you make of President Biden's first State of the Union speech?
I think it was a good speech. He started talking about Russia, and of course, all Americans and people in other places across the world, they agree that this aggression from Russia should stop. So I think that gave him impetus as he moved along the other issues that he wanted to tackle, foreign policy issues, especially competition with China, but also domestic issues like how to finally overcome the COVID-19 pandemic, the infrastructure bill that he would like Congress to pass. So I think that overall it was a well-crafted State of the Union address, and I think he tackled the main issues that we expected him to focus on.
Now, President Biden's address comes at a time where his approval rating is taking a fair bit of a hit, mostly due to economic issues. There was also the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan and other things. However, the majority of Americans polled straight after the State of the Union said they generally approved of what Biden had to say. Do you think this will give him some temporary bump in his poll numbers? And do you think that he can get his presidency back on track to save what looks like it could be a rather disastrous midterms for the Democrats in November?
I think so. I think that he will get a bounce from the address. When it comes to foreign policy, obviously, the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been widely praised, as opposed to the issue that you were mentioning, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And when it comes to domestic politics, now there is economic growth, growth in the number of jobs. We are starting to forget the COVID-19 pandemic in many countries, and that includes the US. Of course, there are negatives. There is very high inflation, and it seems that this will continue all the way to the midterm elections. But when it comes to the elections themselves, the bounce that he will get from the address might not be enough because there seems to be discontent with economic matters among many American voters, and also on social issues where there are many voters that feel that his party is too liberal, and they don't agree with this.
But, Professor, some of Biden's critics would say his speech focused on what he actually hopes to do compared to the current State of the Union. So, in your opinion, what has Biden achieved so far, and what has he failed?
I would agree with this criticism. He was really looking forward. He was really talking about what he wants to do, infrastructure, the economy, welfare he was talking about, as well, taxes. And I think this may be one of his main failures, that with the Democratic Party controlling both chambers of Congress, he has not been able to pass many of the bills that he hoped would already be in place and that would be helping the American economy. So I think this is a big failure. Now, in terms of successes, you could argue that he's really widely perceived to be a decent person, a decent president. And that was not always the case, as we know, with the previous US president, with President Donald Trump. So I think that's a positive that may help him as he moves forward. Plus, I think once inflation starts to come under control, if you look at our economic figures, growth, jobs, they're quite positive. So this could actually help him moving forward as well. And you could argue has been a success over the past year, the rebound in the American economy since the deaths really caused by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, it's really having a tough time getting any legislation through, even, like you say, controlling both houses of Congress, because it seems like even the Democrats are very polarized between the ultra-left wing side of the party and the more traditional Democrat side of things. However, what do you think Americans care about the most when it comes to pulling the lever for either one of the parties? Is it still squarely the economy? Because right now Biden has this nightmare of like soaring inflation. They kept saying that they might be able to get a handle on it, but who knows what will happen there. Soaring oil prices, which Americans are super sensitive to, rising prices at the pump, they don't like that. Do you think that will remain as a number one issue? And we saw a maskless Congress for the first time in quite a long time on Tuesday. Do you think COVID is gradually becoming less and less of an issue in terms of voters in the United States?
I do think that the economy is going to be a drag as the elections approach, especially now, of course, with the war or the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the sanctions being imposed by Russia, not only by the US, but also by Europe, Korea, Japan, other countries. Prices of oil are going to go up. Gas prices are going to go up, at the very least in Europe, but this will have a knock-on effect probably at the global level as well. Some food prices, for example, could go up because of the food stuff that comes from Russia and especially from Ukraine. So it is unlikely that inflation will be under control over the next 6 months or even longer. So that's going to be a drag for him. On the other hand, there might be some goodwill from American voters because, as we see in these images, people are taking off their masks. The COVID-19 pandemic is becoming a thing of the past in the US, as in many other countries across the world, or at the very least in developed countries. And that could actually help him if by then voters haven't forgotten that there was a pandemic and they have moved on to other issues. But it could be that over the next 6 months, as more restrictions are removed and people can go back to a normal life in the US, they may feel thankful to the president, especially if there is no new variant that brings cases up, and therefore the president looks competent in managing the pandemic in a way that the previous president, Donald Trump, was not seen by American voters.
All right, Professor. Thank you so much for your insights. Hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
And now to the election front. Millions of people in South Korea got to watch the country's 4 main presidential candidates go head-to-head one last time on Wednesday night in the last televised debate before the March 9th election. The candidates exchanged verbal barbs over a variety of societal issues facing South Korea. Kim Yeon-sung reports.
The last debate before the election. The 4 major presidential candidates once again going head-to-head Wednesday night during a televised debate hosted by the National Election Commission. The topic: social issues. Candidates dove straight into their views on South Korea's welfare program.
I will implement an employment insurance policy for everybody, so people don't have to worry about jobs. I'll also guarantee minimum income through basic income and other benefits.
The virtuous cycle between growth and welfare is crucial. Social service welfare contributes more to creating a sustainable virtuous cycle rather than cash handouts.
There are three important points to remember when it comes to welfare: building policies by life cycle, ending absolute poverty, and reaching out to find any potential blind spots.
A country where we don't worry about hospital bills, housing, income cutoffs, life after retirement, and where the handicapped can be independent and happy.
The candidates also clashed heavily on the issue of taxation.
If you are a candidate that represents the wealthy, why don't you put more of a tax burden on the rich?
Rather than increasing taxes, it would be better if we could cut the temporary budget for short-term economic stimulus.
I'm telling you clearly, I do not plan to increase taxes.
Candidates also discussed ways to boost the country's chronically low birth rate. Feminism was quickly brought to the fore.
Candidate Yoon, you said the reason for our low birth rate is feminism, and that because of feminism, men and women don't date. What is feminism in your opinion, and do you still think this way?
Feminism is a type of humanism. I think it's about respecting women as humans.
Candidate Yoon, I don't understand why shutting down the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family is one of your pledges for young adults, unless you're trying to earn some misogynistic votes by pitting young men and women against each other.
After the debate, Lee said he believes the South Korean people will make the right decision for the future of the country. Yoon said he will spend every available second until the end of the race to get the best result possible. Shim slammed her rivals, saying it was an unqualified talk among unqualified candidates. And said he will use each day like a year to ensure the South Korean people know he's sincere. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
Now, just moments ago, a press briefing has been held at the National Assembly over a campaign merger between the two conservative presidential candidates. Yoon Suk-yeol of the main opposition People Power Party and An Chol-soo of the minor opposition People's Party at 8 a.m. made a joint announcement to unify campaigns based on mutual political values and the merger of the two parties after the election. This comes just a day before early voting begins, with all eyes on whether this could be a potential game changer in the current neck-and-neck race between the PPP's Yoon Suk-yeol and the ruling Democratic Party's candidate Lee Jae-myung. Yoon Suk-yeol will likely go ahead with plans to campaign in central and southern regions today, and plans remains undecided. Lee Jae-myung and Shim Sang-jung of the Justice Party are scheduled to rally support in Seoul today. More updates in our later newscast.
South Koreans with COVID-19 will be permitted to vote in next week's presidential election. The Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasures Headquarters will allow patients and self-isolating individuals to step out of their living quarters on the day of the election on March 9th and on March 5th for early voting. However, they can only go out after 5 p.m. and only for the purpose of casting their ballots. Temporary polling stations will be set up and local health centres will send 6 messages before the day and on the day of voting to inform people with COVID-19 of the various safety precautions. The early voting period for South Korea's presidential election is set for Thursday and Friday for those unable to make it on the actual March 9th election day. However, with neither of the top two contenders enjoying a clear lead in the polls, victory is likely to hinge on voter turnout among those candidates' respective groups of supporters. Lee Kyung-eun with the details.
In past presidential elections, 1 week before Election Day, it was usually possible to predict a winner. That's Wednesday for this election, the last chance to gauge the public sentiment as polls are banned from being published after Thursday ahead of early voting. However, the latest results show the outcome is still highly uncertain. as Lee Jae-myung of the ruling Democratic Party and Yoon Suk-yeol of the main opposition People Power Party are neck and neck with any lead coming within the margin of error. The race is tighter than ever as both candidates' ratings have gone up. One of the areas deciding this highly unpredictable race will be the capital region, which together accounts for nearly 50% of voters and yet has no clear favorite. Also important will be candidates' ratings in their rival strongholds, which are currently higher than seen in the past. Lee stands at nearly 30% in the traditional conservative strongholds of Daegu and Gyeongsang-Bukdo province in the southeast, while Yoon also about 25% in the liberal stronghold Jeolla region in the southwest. The goal in these areas is to prevent their rivals from taking a landslide victory. In terms of age, those in their 40s and 50s show a tendency toward Lee, while those in their 20s and over 60s favor Yoon. Those in their 30s are largely split between the two, making them a key voter segment. But after all, with daily infections to top 230,000 by election day, the key is the voter turnout of each age group. Some 75% say they will come out to vote despite infection, with the figure dropping to 58% among those in their 20s. To avoid losing potential votes, candidates are urging voters to participate in early voting on Friday and Saturday. Polls show more liberal supporters will vote early than conservatives. There's also a significant number of voters who haven't made up their minds yet, but will so in the next 2 days, with Wednesday's debate helping them make their decision. Lee Hyung-eun, Arirang News.
Now we are going to cross over to our Oh Se-young for global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thank you, Mark. It's time for Global Insight. After a year of negotiations on steps to revive a deal aimed to curb Iran's nuclear development, signed by Iran, the US, Russia and European countries, officials negotiating the revival said that they were just days away from reaching a compromise. But at the same time, other reports seem to indicate that the negotiators seem to be on very different pages. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action negotiated by the Obama administration was scrapped by former President Donald Trump, who claimed that it hadn't been effective. So amid efforts today to revive this deal, we discuss where the talks are currently and where they're going. For this, we have joining us Abolghasem Beyanat, former postdoctoral research fellow and current associate at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. We also have Hyun-do Park, professor at the Seogang Euromina Institute at Seogang University. Very warm welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us. And well, to begin with you, Professor Beyanat. Now, we're wondering about the current status of the negotiations and what some of the concerns are at this point that the negotiators have.
Well, of course, not many details are available, as the negotiators are really keeping a tight hit, on the information coming from negotiations. But some of the major challenges of the talks are really addressing Iran's concerns about guarantees for guaranteeing that a future U.S. administration would not withdraw from the nuclear deal, and also ensuring that Iran actually reaps the economic benefits of the deal. So these are some of the major tricky issues that the parties are trying to settle.
And well, Professor Park, former US President Donald Trump, he withdrew the US from the deal in 2018, claiming that it failed to curtail Iran's missile program and regional influence as well. Did Tehran comply with the deal initially? Would you say, what were the concerns there?
As a matter of fact, Iran has complied with the original JCPOA until 1 year after the former President Trump withdrew from the JCPOA. But after 2019, Iran kept pressuring on the United States by by not complying faithfully with the original plan, and also extended its own capacity to develop nuclear programs. That has been a great concern for especially the Western negotiators and also the very hardline conservatives in the United States.
Professor Bernard, how do you see this? How do you see this compliance issue that people have been raising?
Well, as Professor Park mentioned, Iran was compliant by the nuclear deal even 1 year after, the U.S. withdrew from the deal in May 2018. And the International Atomic Energy Agency verified that Iran remained strictly compliant by the terms of the deal until 1 year after the deal. So the reason Iran, withdrew from the deal was that the remaining parties, European parties, and Russia and China were not able to protect their own trade, their own foreign trade with Iran, and also guarantee the economic benefits of the deal for Iran. So the fact that they were not able to compensate the economic losses, of the U.S. withdrawal from the deal and the reimposition of U.S. secondary sanctions on Iran. So Iran had to gradually roll back its JCPOA commitments, so to provide incentives for the U.S. To come back to the negotiating table and come back into compliance.
Professor Bernard, of course, after former President Trump withdrew from the deal, he reimposed much harsher economic sanctions on the Iranian economy. And, well, how have economic sanctions been posing a challenge for the Iranian government? And also, how will Iran be able to cope with the sanctions if a deal is not reached?
Well, the economic sanctions affect Iran's economy through many ways, but there are two major or important channels that sanctions affect Iran's economy. First, by affecting public revenues, as well as affecting the value of Iran's national currency. These two major factors are affected because Iran is heavily reliant on the export of oil and petrochemical products for both public revenues as well as foreign exchange income. And so these two major issues, lower government revenues and devalued national currencies, send ripple effects throughout the economy. Iran has been trying to adopt some domestic economic policies to minimize the economic impacts of the sanctions by restricting the import of luxurious imports, as well as the imports of those products which compete with domestic products, as well as expanding the social safety nets for the people. And external opportunities for circumventing sanctions or sanction busting, such as by expanding its foreign trade. With China, Iran has been able to weather the storm and survive. But at the end of the day, what really helped the Iranian government to weather the storm and to survive has been its ability to legitimize its nuclear and its wider foreign policy to its public opinion, and so that the public would be able to support the government position and as well as be able to tolerate economic hardships arising from economic sanctions.
And Professor Park, in recent days, there seems to have been much more urgency to reach an agreement between the negotiators between Iran, Russia, and the Western world. How does the Ukraine crisis, with Ukraine being at war with Russia, how has this crisis affected the process on negotiations to revive the Iran nuclear deal?
As a matter of fact, there are a lot of speculations about the effect of the Ukraine crisis on the nuclear deal right now. Not right now, actually, in progress in Vienna. And also there are a lot of conflicting speculations on it. But some scholars believe that it will definitely affect on the progress of the nuclear deal. But others actually would not believe that it will affect at all on the nuclear deal. But right now, actually, on the Iranian side, Iranian media advisors, for example, Dr. Marandi said to the media that the Ukraine crisis should not be any factor in delaying or incomplete deal the negotiators make in Vienna. So I'm not very sure whether the Ukraine crisis is really affecting the Iranian deal. But what is certain is that both sides, I mean the West and Russia, and at the same time the Iran, they're all concerned about how the Ukraine crisis will fold out influencing the decisions made in Vienna.
And Professor Bayinat, how would you see this? How do you think that the Ukraine crisis is going to impact or is impacting the progress on negotiations? Do you think it perhaps gives Tehran the upper hand?
I agree. Yes, I agree that there are speculations. There are arguments both for and against this, how the Ukraine crisis might impact. Some would predict that it will have a negative impact because of the Russia and Western confrontations. Russia might be tempted to play the spoiler's role and become less cooperative in nuclear negotiations if it does not have adequate leverage, in its confrontation with the U.S. and European powers over Ukraine. Iran might also feel that it has the upper hand because Western countries are now more in need of stabilizing the global oil market and trying to reintegrate Iran into the world energy market, as well as the fact that Russia and Western confrontation might provide opportunities for Iran to resist the sanctions. So these are the forces that might act against it. But I believe the Ukraine crisis might have just marginal and short-term impacts on the trajectory of the nuclear talks, because there are important factors and forces which brought the parties to the negotiating tables, and those very forces are still present. And the fact that the time is not really on neither party, neither the U.S. nor Iran's side. So both parties have important incentives to revive the nuclear deal, and time is not really on neither party's side. So in that sense, and I believe the Ukraine crisis will only have might only have a short-term impact, on the talks, and it will not be able to derail the talks, for longer terms.
Sure. And Professor Park, well, how do you think the pace of these negotiations are going to affect the global oil market?
Well, actually, the oil market is not very right now reliable. So probably the world market needs to have more oils from the Iran. But more than anything else, actually the OPEC Plus and also the Saudi Arabia assures the world that the market will be stable. But probably in the very short time and also in the long run, the world needs to have the Iran export the oil to the world market. But some scholars actually believe that the Iranian oil would not affect very much on the oil market because it will take about 6 to 9 months for Iran to export a large quantity of oil. So I'm not very sure right now, but the pace of negotiations in Vienna right now is almost wrapping up the decision. And also the Western side tried to keep a pressure on Iran to conclude JCPOA as soon as possible, whereas the Iranian team likes to take more time in order not to be pressured into a hasty and incomplete deal with the West.
Professor Bayinat, would you agree? Do you think perhaps Tehran is taking a bit more time to really conclude this deal?
Yeah, I think I agree, but Iran really doesn't want to repeat, the mistake because, the new administration is very critical of the previous reformist administration. They think they were not really careful and they were hasty, and because the JCPOA was not really is not a strong agreement in terms of preventing, non-compliance by the other party, especially the U.S., and also guaranteeing the economic benefits of the deal. So the short thing is that they don't want to really repeat the same mistake, and they want to enter into an agreement which is solid and guarantees survivability for a longer term, and also guarantees the economic benefits of the deal. So in that sense, they are not rushed, but at the same time, they don't also have too much time on their hand. Because they're also under pressure, domestic economic pressure, so they also want to really get the removal of the sanctions and to give a boost to domestic economy.
I see. And Professor Weiner, how do you see the deal impacting us here in South Korea?
Well, that's a good question. I think, unlike the U.S., which did not have really very significant, trade with Iran because of the U.S. primary sanctions, which prohibits American companies from doing business with Iran. South Korea was one of the major trade partners of Iran. And the mutual trade of South Korea and Iran stood at around $17 billion the year right after the entry into force of the nuclear deal. But after the U.S. withdrawal and the reimposition of sanctions, the bilateral trade of Iran and South Korea has come to nearly zero. So the removal of the sanctions and the revival of the deal will open up great business opportunities for South Korea. There are great opportunities, especially in auto industry, electronic appliances, medical supplies, and also South Korea could also benefit from Iran by diversifying the source of its fossil fuel energy imports as well as petrochemical products, which will be in the interest of both countries.
Well, from our understanding, talks have already begun from both sides, Iran and South Korea, to discuss what kind of business, what areas of business can be resumed. And well, Professor Park, how do you think that the progress on reviving the JCPOA will affect South Korean businesses?
The biggest concern for the Korean government and the Korean business right now is how to repay, $7 billion frozen Iranian asset frozen in Korean banks. Actually, it has been a headache for Korean government. And more than anything else, if the nuclear deal is concluded, Korean government will be more than happy to give the money back to Iran, because it has become a big obstacle between two governments. Korean government likes to give it back to the Iranian government, but we cannot do that because of the American sanctions on the Iran. And so the $7 billion is a key word in understanding the current situation, especially the foreign relations between Korea and Iran. And secondly, Korean businessmen will be very happy, but this time probably they are much more cautious than ever before. Iran has been a land of opportunity, especially for Korean businessmen, but the Koreans experienced hard time for the last almost 7 years. And right now, even if Iranian market is widely open, Korean businessmen will take a deep breath and they take a very cautious approach to the land of opportunity. So this time, the conclusion of the nuclear deal would not press the businessmen to run into the Iranian market hastily as before.
That was Arirang Simbayan with Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and Hyundal Park at Arirang University. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell says the Fed will begin carefully raising interest rates at its upcoming March meeting, but will be ready to move more aggressively if inflation does not cool as quickly as policymakers expect. Speaking Wednesday, Powell noted he will back a 0.25 percentage point increase during the two-day meeting in mid-March, but added that the Fed could use larger or more frequent rate moves if inflation doesn't slow. He also called the Russian invasion of Ukraine a game changer that could have unpredictable economic consequences. And now for a look at news from around the world. We have Lee Seung-jae joining us from Arirang newsroom. Good morning, Seung-jae.
Good morning to you guys.
Now, the UN Environment Assembly has approved a resolution that's being dubbed the most significant Green Deal since the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. Tell us more.
That's right. So the UN Environment Assembly on Wednesday approved a resolution to create the world's first ever global plastic pollution treaty, meaning work will now begin to set out legally binding rules on plastic waste and should be finalized by the end of 2024. Now, with the approval, the 175 UN delegates in Nairobi agreed to negotiate the first steps towards curbing plastic pollution, and comes as member states held talks for over a week to fight the soaring problem. Now, plastic production has been on the rise exponentially in the past decade and now amounts to some 400 million tons per year, a figure that's expected to double by 2040. Now, the latest agreement also creates a roadmap for treaty negotiations that are set to begin in May. Now, over in Syria, 11 people have reportedly been killed and 7 others injured after a fire broke out at a shopping mall located in the capital Damascus earlier on Tuesday. The fire ravaged the Lamarida Mall in Hamra Street, one of the most famous marketplaces in the capital, and firefighters were seen rushing to the scene to extinguish the blaze, which also led to some being taken to the hospital suffering from smoke inhalation. An investigation is ongoing to determine the cause of the fire, which also resulted in massive damage and loss of property. And finally, Russian businessman Roman Abramovich announced Wednesday that he has decided to sell his Chelsea football club 19 years after purchasing the London side. But he's also promised to donate money from the sale to help victims of the war in Ukraine, as he told his aide to set up a charitable foundation which would receive all net proceeds from the sale. And the move comes as there's been growing calls in Britain for Abramovich to be included in economic measures because of his links to the Russian state. The 55-year-old is one of the world's most powerful businessmen, with Forbes putting his net worth at $13.3 billion US.
Good morning. Well, another sign that we know that spring is here, big temperature differences between lows and highs. In fact, southern provinces will see a difference of nearly 15 degrees Celsius today. Sunny skies will be a feature all day nationwide, so it could have been a brilliant early spring day if we could be toxic smog-free. Ultrafine dust will cover the capital and Chungcheongdo and Jeollabuk-do provinces all day long, but elsewhere should have decent air quality. Morning temperatures are 4 to 5 degrees higher than the same time yesterday under mostly sunny skies this morning. And highs will be 2 to 5 degrees higher this afternoon. Southern regions seeing highs in the mid-teens this afternoon. Then light spring rain is in the forecast in central regions tomorrow afternoon, which should not be enough to ease the dryness in the air. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the world.
And that's all we have for now. New Day at Arirang will be back at 8 a.m. Korea time on Friday. I'm Kim Mo-gyan.
And I'm Mark Bream. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and thank you as always for tuning in. Until next time, goodbye.